Hi, I'm Sherry, and welcome to this E-rate session. I'm pleased to have Sabrina here. She is the Oregon E-rate state representative, and she's going to tell us about the new and changing world of E-rate.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You should begin.
Okay, awesome. So, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I saw that there were only about 7 people signed up, and so I did not expect so many people. I'm glad you're all here. Um, Today, the title is A New E-Rate World Order, and the truth of the matter is that there's so much to talk about. That an hour and 15 minutes is not going to be enough to impart to you all of the things that I want to tell you. What I've done is I've picked up a few things that I want to bring to your attention and put on your radar, and I want to give each of you an opportunity. If something that I have here has affected you, or if there's something that's not on here that's affected you that is causing problems, I want to be able to take notes about it and advocate for the state, because here probably in the next couple of months there's going to be an opportunity to speak with representatives from USAC and possibly even the FCC. And so I want to continue to gather information about how some of these changes, or some of these things aren't changes yet. They're signs. They're things that are starting to cause concern. A change in administration is always kind of an interesting time, because we don't always know what's going to happen. And this one in particular has brought some pretty swift but seemingly minor changes that are causing great concern because of what could happen. And so what I want to do is just take some time to introduce some ideas to you, and talked about some things that I've had. There's been newsletters and stuff in the past, but not everybody reads those. I get it, you're busy. So but what I really also want to do is make this a conversation. I want you guys to drive the conversation. So my agenda is actually very short. But what I want to do is stop on each slide and give somebody an opportunity to tell me about a situation that affected them, okay? So I want this to be a two-way conversation. So a few of the things that I want to talk about are the E-rate Productivity Center, or ACPEnw. We make all kinds of jokes about the word epic in relationship to this piece of software. And it escalated all the way up to the chairman of the FCC. So it's no secret that we need to talk about it and figure out, how to get through these last days of the filing window. We'll talk a little bit about the new FCC administration and behaviors that we're seeing, assumptions we could make, things just to be mindful of. And then dark fiber special construction. There's so many question marks going into last funding year, 2016 funding year, and some of those questions went unanswered or vaguely answered. Some of them were answered, and now some of those answers appear to possibly be changing. And so I want to put that on your radar too, for those of you that have either applied for dark fiber or special construction or are considering doing so. I will give a little bit of credit to things that are working, and I'd actually like to hear from you as well, what you think is working better in the E-rate program. What's something that you thought, hey, they got this one right? Because that's something I actually want to take back to them as well. It's really easy to beat up on those guys at USAC, but there's some of them that have been there since the beginning or very close to the beginning, and they're people that stayed when Epic got really bad. People stayed. They worked extra hours. They worked hard to try and get it done, even though it was a lost cause almost from the beginning. And so it would be great to be able to talk to them, not just about the things that are going wrong, but the things that are going right, not just from my perspective, but from yours. I'll talk about a couple of challenges and things, little things that we've come across, bumps in the road. And I want to hear too about, I can't come up with every scenario. I don't always hear about your challenges. Sometimes you handle them on your own. You don't call me. That's okay. But I would like to know, because again, this is useful information moving forward. And then I want to talk about a new opportunity, and we actually have somebody in the room who might have some extra information to share as well. And if we have time, I'd like to give her an opportunity to say something if she wants to. If she wants to. Okay.
Most of it with me, so you can.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so talking about Epic, some of the things that caused us heartburn this year. There's a lot of nitpicky little things. I mean, tab stops not going in the right order, not being able to alphabetize lists, not being able to show more than 5 or 10 records at a time depending on the page. Those things are annoying, but they don't stop the functionality of Epic. But there were things that happened that that because they tried to use a content management system to administer this incredibly complex program, and it didn't always work. And so some things that that came to mind are, the new entity profile deadline. How many of you after that deadline had a new entity or a new school, or somebody's data changed and you didn't catch it in time? Did anybody have problems with an entity that, and then you had to call client services, and sometimes you couldn't get it fixed, right? Sometimes they said, well, just put it in the narrative of the 471 and we'll fix it during review. That was their big thing last year too. So the purpose of doing that made sense at the time. It was when they realized last year that Epic would not allow, the way they configured it, every time somebody updated their district data, the consortium that they were connected to, their data changed as well. And so that is what that was a huge problem last year, and that's why we had 2 windows. The first one was for district applicants, the second one was for consortia. And this year, in order to try and create just one filing deadline, they created this little mini deadline at the beginning where you had X amount of time to update your entities. Well, that was great, except some of us had schools that were under construction. We didn't have all the information we needed. Sometimes we had, there were entities that dropped off, or some had been closed and then reopened and things like that didn't happen until after that deadline. And that deadline, of course, was the day before the filing window opened. So there wasn't a lot of time, to figure out what needed to be done. So while it's making it nicer for consortia, it has made it a little more difficult for some districts. And so I just wanted to talk about that a little bit and see if anybody had anything they wanted to share. I do have a pretty, extreme circumstance where an entity almost wasn't able to file their forms because client services and USAC management didn't understand. They were giving conflicting information. Did anybody find it difficult to communicate or to get the correct information from client services about this issue, or did most of you just have pretty smooth sailing with that? Good. Okay. So some other things that, some issues that Epic caused were funding delays due to not just what I have here. There were lots of different things that were affected. But when they created the modernization order, they dark fiber and special construction, and some of the pieces of that installation, such as hardware for dark fiber, they were considered category 1, where specifically hardware was considered category 2. And then on the converse side, some things that used to be category 2, such as fiber installation on your campus and things like that, those were switched over to category 1. So things kind of flip-flopped, and especially for folks who had multi-year contracts that had already negotiated these contracts and gotten these services. One year they were filing for something as category 1, but the next year it was category 2. And the two sides couldn't talk to each other. They couldn't reference you could reference the correct form 470, but it didn't jive, right? It didn't add up. And so the FCC actually had to intervene and create a waiver to allow FRNs that included services that used to be in one category and had to shift to the other to do so. And that's why it took so long to get that done, is because it had to go all the way up to the FCC. So did any of you get caught in that in 2016? Did any of you have an FRN, or maybe how many of you have not yet been funded for 2016? Is there anyone here that didn't get their FCDL yet? Okay, well that's great. There's still several hundred that, across the country that have not been funded, and I know of a few myself. And a lot of those are just, they are ready, they're wave ready is what they're called, but they can't actually be committed because right now they're doing all that back end work to try and put everything in its place so that EPIC can issue the funding commitment. So I'm glad to hear that nobody in this room was affected by that, because I've seen a couple folks really have trouble with it. Did anyone else get a really late funding commitment and have a different reason? Tell me what happened with you.
We had Category 2 funding that was just approved about 3 or 4 weeks ago.
And did you go through a lengthy review process, or was there a lot of scrutiny, or did they just sit on it forever?
They would ask some clarifying questions about one thing and then sit on it for a month and then ask another clarifying question and sit on it.
Yeah. And that, I think staffing was an issue too, because they kept having to pull people from one group and move them to a different group to focus on whatever crisis they were dealing with. So you didn't have problems with eligibility of the equipment or them questioning the eligibility or anything like that?
We had a couple schools that we had asked for more than the school budget was allowed, and so we had to submit revised spreadsheets to match.
Yeah, they could not handle the idea that we would agree to cover anything beyond the discount, maximum, right? The budget maximum. And so they forced a lot of people to reduce their funding commitments. Now, here's the backhand of that issue, that people then later on, maybe they'd find that, oh, we didn't need this extra switch because we realized that, these two were close enough together that we could share a switch or something like that, millions of scenarios. But what would happen is, once you'd reduced your funding request or removed hardware from your list, you couldn't add it back. Like if you took a switch away over here, you couldn't add a new one over here, because you'd already taken it off of your list of equipment. And that was a really frustrating thing, and we anticipated that from the beginning, and we pushed really hard for the FCC and USAC to be reasonable about this and say, look, if we ask for something, we know you're not going to commit more than our budget. We know this. Why can't you just go ahead and let us keep our equipment list? That way, if things like this happen, we can maintain our funding. And they just, I think that there were, pardon me, too many technical barriers to them being able to do that. Anybody else have a weird situation that caused a delay in their funding, or just an exorbitantly long wait that they don't understand?
I think the only problem I really had was because we started our install in April, and it says you can start in April before the funding year. All my bills got rejected because their system couldn't handle an April date.
Did you get it? Were you able to get it resolved?
Yeah,
Okay.
but
It took a long time. Yeah.
Yes.
And that's, again, it seems like it's a rule issue, but it's really not. A lot of these issues are not because USAC doesn't understand what's happening. It's not because the FCC says it's not okay to do what you're doing. It's literally because EPIC could not manipulate the data in the way that it needed to happen. And so that's, the core issue with trying to use that particular mechanism to create the application system, and hopefully, they find something better. So talking about the new FCC administration, I am not interested in getting political, and if I accidentally do so, please do not take it that way. That's not how it's meant. Chairman Pai was a commissioner on the or at the FCC for several years, and he was actually part of the group that voted on the modernization order, and he and a fellow commissioner, O'Reilly, they were opposed to several components of the modernization order, particularly to do with additional funding and concerns about overbuilding. And so there has been a lot of concern and speculation about, the new chairman because, he does have some ability to kind of roll some of this stuff back. Now, that when I started thinking about this problem, I thought, well, probably in 2018 we're going to see some changes, right? We're too far into 2017, by the time he was actually, officially the chairman. But he started making a lot of seemingly really harmless changes, right? Like increasing transparency and those kinds of things. But one of the more alarming things that he did was he took a report that was created just before the previous chairman left office. It was basically a progress report. It was where we're at, where we're going, how things are working. And the new chairman basically forced the wireline division to pull that report back. And so that's not something that happens very often. And his reasoning for that was that it was, a midnight document that they snuck in right before, it didn't go through the board, etc. But we still yet have not seen a new document, and we don't understand really what it is that he truly disagreed with about it. So that was something that got some attention, and so there was actually a letter. Several leaders, I think it was their congressmen, right? I think they were. It was, yeah. There's several of them got together and wrote a letter in support of the E-rate program and voicing their concerns that he was going to do something harmful to it. And he responded in a very, I can't think of the word that I was trying to use, sanitary way. It's very, very straightforward that he supported the program and wanted it to be easier and more transparent. But the fact remains that there's been a lot of issues with the program, and he has a lot of leverage at this point. He wrote this really scathing letter to USAC about EPIC, and no matter what side of the aisle you're on, no matter what you think about the chairman's thoughts on the E-rate program, there's not a lot in that letter to disagree with, unfortunately. EPIC is not performing, and it has become a detriment to the program and a significant challenge for a lot of our applicants. And just this morning it was announced that the CEO of USAC, Chris Henderson, resigned. Now, I don't know for sure if it was directly as a result of that letter or if it was something else that was going on, but it's another significant change. We had, several senior managers at USAC leave after the modernization order, particularly right when things started getting really bad with EPIC. There were some folks that left because it wasn't working, and I think they just found better opportunities that were maybe less stressful. I don't know. But another change in leadership at USAC is going to, potentially cause significant changes in the program, especially if somebody gets in there that's really sympathetic to, any changes that the chairman wishes to make. And if those changes include, rolling back some of those additional funds that were allocated for things like Category 2, those are things we want to be aware of, especially when we're signing contracts for these things. It's really scary to sign a contract for something and not know if you're going to get that funding support that you're counting on. So, has anybody been following what's going on with the commissioner? Does anybody have any concerns, or are you guys just too busy to deal with any of that political stuff? Yeah. Normally I would be too. Okay, so now this is the big one. Dark fiber and special construction. How many of you went out to bid for a dark fiber special construction project? Did any of you get a funding denial?
No, but we're in our fourth round of questions.
Oh, gosh. Did you get the questions that came out a couple weeks ago?
Yes, about how many strands.
Yes.
They don't want to fund more than 2 strands.
What district are you with?
Lake Oswego.
Okay. Okay, there were 6 districts, there were 7 letters total sent, and there were 6 districts that they were sent to. And thankfully, that's supposed to be a one and done. Like, if you didn't get the letter, you're not going to. But these questions, there are several, uneasy things about them. Just, the detail that they're going into and stuff it's annoying, because this is, like you said, several rounds of questions for many of us. How many rounds did we go through? I mean, yeah, it was ridiculous. And but what's more alarming to me is that some of these letters went out to applicants that were already funded. Okay? Another thing that alarms me about it is the emphasis that they put in the letter that cost allocation of construction costs was not contingent on the number of strands that you were installing, because we all know in the real world the industry standard's 12 strands, right? If you want fewer strands, you actually have to special order. It actually makes the cost go up, right? The cost of digging the trench for 2 strands versus 12 strands is absolutely no different. The only possible difference is the manholes or the handholes, where you might be able to tie into those extra strands of fabric or fiber. I'm tired. So, but there's maybe a few extra bits of cost there, but nothing significant. And they hadn't really expressed concern about that in the past. And particularly for those entities that have already been funded and have maybe already started or even completed their project, the concern is that that new emphasis on construction costs could result in a change in the rules, or reinterpretation of the rules. And the FCC does have the authority to do that. Doing it retroactively, that would be a new one. They've tried to do that once before with invoicing, and there was enough of an uproar where they said, okay, sorry, we meant next year, not this last year. Don't, sorry, our bad. But this is something that, I have no real evidence or proof that that's what their intention is, but it is just an uneasy feeling. And it's something that you should be talking about with your leadership, just in case. Not alarmist, not freak out, but okay, so what are we going to do if? Identifying, our higher government leadership and helping to, get their input and support behind it, having them start writing letters. If this actually comes to fruition, we've got to get angry about it. We've got to set some boundaries and say, look, fine, if you're going to do that moving forward, that's a bummer, but you can't do it going back. You can't go backwards after we've already built out these networks and tell us that we have to give half our funding back. So, and that's not just, my thought on the matter. This is something that a lot of coordinators fear. They're seeing a lot of writing on the wall. It's really uncomfortable. Another thing is, how many of you have, so you've gotten, several of you did dark fiber special construction. How many of you have not completed construction yet? Okay. Now, are you waiting on a funding commitment before you start, or you're doing it anyway? You're just in process.
Yep.
How are things going to go if you don't get funding?
We're just going to have to pay the full
You just,
boat,
and you're able to do that at least. Okay.
as far as I'm aware.
Good.
We may go bankrupt.
Not funny,
Yeah.
right? Well, so, this may or may not affect anybody in the room but you, but there, normally historically when we had new services, whether they were monthly services or one-time equipment purchases, we always had until September 30th after the end of the funding year to complete that installation. If it happened after June 30th, we didn't get any of the monthly services discounted, but we got the installation or the purchase price discounted as we had applied for. And when they created the modernization order, one of the things that they said was that the fiber had to be lit by the end of the funding year, which made sense to everybody, but we all interpreted that in the E-rate community as meaning September 30th, because that's when all new services have to be installed by. And it wasn't until the training, the actual applicant training last year that they started to say, well, no, the end of the funding year is the June 30th. So, we started to get a little worried about that. And then, as time went on and it took so much longer to get funding commitments for these dark fiber and special construction projects, we realized, that this is a serious problem. And we, screamed for a solution. We needed an extension mechanism or a reinterpretation to give people at least until that September 30th deadline. And they finally came up and, with an extension process, which was relatively simple and easy to do. But to my knowledge, no one's application for an extension has been approved yet. Have you heard any different?
I think Salem.
So nobody from Salem Kaiser in here?
No. I think
They actually got an approval?
I think Bob has a 1-year extension.
Oh, I will have to ask him about that. Yeah.
Check with him. He's here somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. Because
Yeah,
I
he said
hadn't
it was
heard of it.
relatively easy, which surprised him. They were very generous. Gave him the full year.
That's great. Because I know the process to request it was really easy, but none of my people that I'm aware of have gotten an answer. And one of them's got a $1.5 million project. So it's a little unnerving. So it sounds like maybe this isn't affecting anyone in the room.
Can I
But
ask something though, for 17, 18,
yes.
will the deadline be 6/30, 18?
As far as we know, yes. They have not made an official change or reinterpretation of the rules. And so again, because they're still making changes to dark fiber and special construction rules, even after funding, it's really hard to tell what's going to happen for next year. And that kind of goes back to my previous conversation about the new chairman, that there is a potential for quite a bit of change. And normally, I've been able to say with relative certainty in the past, I'm sure you can agree, that we kind of have an idea of where things are going to go, right? We have an idea of the intent of some of these rules. When they do an NPRM or something, we get an idea of why they're asking some of these questions. But there are things that are happening now that are happening quickly. They're happening without comment from the public, and they maybe don't even have to ask us, in some cases, the way, depending on how they do it. So it's a little unnerving. Yeah, so anyway, did anybody have any other problems with special construction or dark fiber that they wanted to bring up or talk about? Most everybody got a funding commitment already. I know we know already where you're at.
We were turned down on a couple of circuits, turned down for making substantial changes after the post.
Yeah.
The substantial change it was told to us that was providing a fiber route map of our internal building fiber to our respondents. That was what they used to turn
Yeah.
down. So we're in dispute, and it's just been month after month. We have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah, you're not the only person that happened to, and it really that's another kind of their new interpretation of cardinal change. That's the term that they use, and if something substantially changes the scope of the project, but providing a map that does not change what was described via text in the RFP. Does not strike me as being a change in scope. But again, that's another one of those things that appears to be sort of a clawback, a way of tweaking and interpreting in order to try and grab back some of those dark fiber funds. And I could be being a little paranoid about it. I'm not afraid to admit that. But there's just a lot of stinky cheese,
So are they reading through the RFP and pulling out pieces that they feel they aren't going to fund? Because if it's part of the RFP packet, I don't understand how they can say that your mapping isn't part of it.
So here's what happened, what he's talking about. Somewhere along the line, maybe during the mandatory walkthrough.
That's what it was.
See, and that's a part that makes it even worse. Okay, so here's the scenario basically. Ugh, this is the stuff that makes me mad. So they let an RFP along with their Form 470, and they described their project. And one of the components of that was that the vendors had to attend a walkthrough, right? So the only way a vendor would be able to bid on that project ever is if they came to that walkthrough. At that walkthrough, they received a map that was not included in the original RFP.
But didn't you do it as an addenda? Because you can post your addenda to
Yep.
them.
And they can now pick out your addenda and say you should have restarted your 28-day clock. You changed the scope of your RFP. Yep, that's what they're calling it. And so even though it did not affect it would never have affected his results, right? Because the vendors who wanted to bid showed up to his mandatory walkthrough, and there was no other vendor that could have bid on that project at that point. But because he gave them a map, they denied his funding. And the same thing happened. Yeah, I didn't want to necessarily call you out, but the same thing happened over here. Yeah.
I had 2 addendas, so now that's got me worried. But I also went an extra month because
That
we
there.
were renegotiating
Yep.
the terms.
And so that may help you. Yeah, I mean, if they, but I mean, on the converse side of that, I don't want to alarm you,
Yeah.
but I do want to warn you. One of the things that I've seen happen is this happened to another applicant of mine that they went through the whole process and did everything, to the best of their ability. They posted stuff up on the web and everything else. And how did it go? It was oh, I lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. Tell me again what you just said.
Well, I posted my addenda online.
And you waited extra time.
Yes, because we had to wait for another board meeting as I was negotiating the
Thank
the
you.
contract.
Sorry. So the part that sticks out to me, you said you had to renegotiate something. So did you go like the 28 days or 30 days or however long it was, and then you did an intent to award at that point, and then
No.
you renegotiated stuff?
No.
Okay, because the reason I brought it up is if you get to the point where you've basically awarded or attempted or intended to award and notified, then if you make changes after that, that's going to restart your clock too. And what they'll do is they'll ask you for all of your bid correspondence, all of your correspondence, emails and stuff between you and your service providers.
The only thing that we changed were the length of the contract. Because in Washington State,
That's
you
cool.
have a 5-year contract, and that's all we changed, so.
Gotcha. Oh, did they come out with a longer one and you
Yeah,
had to
it
have
was
them
a
roll it back?
10-year
Mm-hmm.
with the
And you were
incremental, and I said you can't change it because
Yeah.
that's what my RFP said.
That's
so.
cool. That you should be safe there. So that's good. But I actually had everything was going great, and then they asked for all the email correspondence, and that was part of the regular review. That was not heightened scrutiny or anything like that. And they found a conversation. Apparently, there had been a coffee meeting between the applicant and the service provider. Coffee. And then there was a whole bunch of scrutiny over this coffee meeting and how the gifting rules are. So that extensive volley of questions that you're going through, it does kind of, when you add them all together, it does kind of feel like an agenda a little bit, doesn't it? I mean, I can't just be me. Maybe it can. Alrighty. So challenges. I talked a little bit about some of these things already, but the inability for EPIC to actually complete a funding commitment, not because there's a rule violation or any problems with funding or the documents or anything. It's literally that EPIC, there's something about the situation that's unique enough that EPIC cannot put the pieces together and create a funding commitment. And they can only strong arm it so much, apparently, and so they're having to do software upgrades, and so there's applications that are just sitting there waiting to be funded, waiting for EPIC to be updated so that the funding commitment can be made. And then another thing that we found is how many of you got stuck in that trap last year where they rolled your entity number forward into EPIC, but it changed your entity type and you used to be a consortium and now you're a district, or you used to be a district and now you're a school. Did anybody get stuck in that? Wow, you guys are all really lucky. I don't even know why you came to this. You guys don't need any help at all. Just kidding. But we had a lot of entities that got pulled over, and they were pulled over incorrectly. And so during that process, there was a bunch of changes being made and things like that. And what we found is that there were situations where the changes couldn't be made. For example, we had a consortium who was changed to a district by mistake, and it took over a year for USAC to be able to change them back into a consortium. Meanwhile, they had to file last year's Form 471 as a district, but then write in their narrative that really we're a consortium and here's all our consortium members, and still they could not get their entity changed. And it turned out that the reason was because they were a member of another consortium. And nobody in client services knew enough about the problem to recognize it. And it turned out, I had to actually intervene and get senior management at USAC on the phone and to figure it out. And after a 10-minute phone call, it was resolved. After a year, a year of fighting with this. And so those conflicts, also having to do with that lockout that we had at the beginning, when you come up against a situation where maybe you've got a new school that there wasn't enough information to complete all the, the questions for that entity, they wouldn't let you put an entity in there without a name, so you'd have to make up a name and to put it in there, and then later on you'd try to change the name to the correct name, but you couldn't do that because the profile was locked out. And then you had to get client services involved, and it was a giant mess. And so those are the kinds of things we're coming across that are just making life harder and making the process more frustrating. And so, I say workarounds in here, but really the biggest workaround right now for EPIC is patience. And if you continue, like if you're working with client services on a program or on a problem, and you continue to have difficulty and it just doesn't feel like they're getting what you're talking about, or you're getting conflicting answers from different people, definitely let me know about that, because sometimes it's as simple as getting the right person on the phone. Other times it's a more complicated issue and there's not always something I can do, but definitely keep me in the loop about it, because if I can't solve it for you now, I can take it to Washington with me and talk to them about it then. So there's some issues when, we used to, have any of you ever had to use a Good Samaritan before when you're invoicing, where your previous service provider went out of business or something like that, and you were trying to get your invoices paid, but remember how the invoices used to go through the service provider and then to you? Well, so that part was really frustrating, right? But we would have other entities, other service providers who would basically say, we'll do the pass-through for you. We didn't provide the service, but we'll accept the check and we'll put it in our bank and we'll cut you a new check and we'll sign the paperwork, right? Oops, sorry. And that was all great and fine. Now the service provider is cut out of the loop. But what happens when you're a district who uses a service provider? Maybe you got discounted bills, and then that service provider, maybe they provided the service and everything, but then they go out of business, or they change, or something happens. All of a sudden you can't get your invoices paid, because even though it doesn't go through the service provider, they still have to do invoicing. First of all, if they don't invoice properly, you have trouble. I had somebody tell me just yesterday that a great big major service provider that has no excuses whatsoever withheld invoices and caused somebody to actually miss the invoicing deadline. And the problem with that for me is that the service provider is never ever going to take ownership of that, right? Who are they going to come after for that money? You guys. And that's a big concern. Another is when maybe they're they're invoicing, but they got a new name, right? They're a new entity. They've got a new name. And now we've run into problems with invoicing. We have to go through all these extra hoops. So with the reason, normally these are things that we would eventually work through, but now we have this new invoicing rule. It's not so new anymore, I suppose, but it still bugs me, is you only get one extension as long as you apply for it before the invoicing deadline. Well, that's great, but what if your woes continue until the end of that deadline? What do you do? And right now, we don't have an answer for that. So that's something we're still trying to work on. But has anybody ever had problems getting paid from a vendor or getting invoices from a vendor that caused you problems? That's a pretty lucky audience. Well, all right. Well, then I guess we won't dwell on that too much. So I talked also earlier about the waivers that were issued for taking services that used to be category 1 and shifting them over to the other category and vice versa. And those things are still in process. There, some of the applications that are still being delayed right now are being delayed for that reason, and they're working through that process because it's manual on the back end, and of course we're dealing with the end of the filing window as well. So I think we've covered that one sufficiently already. So now, talking about opportunities. So all of you are familiar with OETC, I'm sure, and but what you may not know is that OETC formed a consortium last year. They've switched their business model, and definitely jump in if I say something dumb. They changed their business model from being a provider, service provider, to a consortium leader. And what they did is basically, in case you hadn't noticed, or you probably never even saw the documentation, but when you sign up as a member for OETC, there is a letter of agency in that application or that document. And so what they've done is they've spent a significant amount of time and energy negotiating contracts on your behalf. And the idea from the very beginning for them, the intent was to allow you to purchase hardware off of their contracts without filing your own Form 470. Because if you were a member of their consortium at the time that they did this, then you could use their establishing Form 470 as your Form 470. Now, from a technical perspective, we're still figuring out how to do that in EPIC, because this is very new, right? They just have gone public with this a couple months ago. Public as in talking to districts about it. And so that I'm still working on fine-tuning that process, because we know that according to the rules, what they've done is 100% okay, right? And they did a fantastic job of going through and learning all the rules and, being very meticulous and careful about their paperwork. My concern is a little bit more on that paranoia side, where I'm nervous that people are going to go in and purchase equipment without the Form 470 of their own. And then somebody at USAC's going to say, well, that doesn't add up. That doesn't seem right to us. Or EPIC isn't going to be able to handle it because how does your district use their 470, right? How does that happen in EPIC? It was not a problem in the old system. That's how everybody who used the SOWIN contract used it. They used DAS's Form 470. And as members of that consortium, they were covered by it, or not, they were covered by that at the time. ODE had DAS had letters of agency. So, but the new system doesn't have that mechanism in place. It'll only allow you to search for your own Form 470s. So the question too becomes, OETC went through and added everybody that they could as consortium members, but there may have been people missing, not because they weren't members, but because EPIC wouldn't allow them to add them, or maybe they didn't have their entities set up properly at that point yet. There's a million reasons that it couldn't have gone right. And so I want to point out to everybody that the opportunity exists because it's an amazing opportunity, and it's exactly what I've been trying to get the state to do for like 11 years now. But it can't be treated quite as a state master contract. It's more of a piggyback contract, but they've done a really great job of making it available to as many people as possible. But I don't think Epic is going to make it possible to use it the way it was intended just yet. And that's why I wanted to bring up these other caveats too. If you want to purchase something off of the OETC contract and you want to be safe and make sure all your bases are covered, what you would do is you would file your own Form 470. Obviously, it's too late this year, but you know, ACPE is when it is. Last year, it was after the window. But you can file your own Form 470 and then use OETC's terms as one of the competing bids, and then you can score them just like any other bid. Now keep in mind that and this is going to be the case in a lot of, you know, pretty much almost all of the circumstances, that there's going to be multiple vendors that could provide the same equipment or service, because they've made it a point to sign up with multiple vendors because they serve so many states at once, because this is a multi-state effort. So if you're looking for something and there are multiple vendors that you need to consider, you with E-rate rules, you still have to do a mini bid, right? And the mini bid rules they're outlined on the website. They're a little more lax. Price still has to be the most heavily weighted factor. 99% of the time, all their prices are going to be the same because it's a price agreement. So then the question is, what do you use as a criteria for a mini bid? And so some things I just will throw out there for you are the distance from your location, that particular vendor. How quickly can they get to you? How does it save on shipping if they're closer to you? Does it save on, you know, time or costs for support if they have to come on site? Past experience with that vendor is also a perfectly viable criteria point for selection. I don't know, what can you think of that would be a good, I mean, viability? Is it some guy out of his garage, or is it, you know, a big organization? Chances are it's probably going to be a bigger guy because, you know, you guys did your job. But the point is that, you know, there's going to be other criteria. As long as price is the most heavily weighted factor, you're probably going to be safe. It does not have to last 28 days. It can be a single session. You just have to document it. So whatever your criteria is, you score it, you document it, and then you notify the vendor in question and you move on.
And you just maintain that, right? They don't have to submit that to USAC.
They would, you maintain it for a minimum of 10 years after the end of the service, right? And then to your point though, you do want to have it handy because of the increased scrutiny that we're seeing. You may want to keep it handy in case they ask you for it during review.
So can I ask you something? On your mini bid, can you solicit from whoever you want? So in other words, can you, let's say, your district standard is Dell Computer, and you know you have a state contract for Dell Computer, and you know OETC has one for Dell Computer, or somebody, or another group that you belong to, a co-op that you belong to does it. Can you selectively ask for bids from those people?
Let me rephrase your question and make sure I understand it.
Okay.
So you filed your own Form 470 at this point. You have several, you know, mass purchasing agreements that you could potentially choose from.
Right.
I would suggest that you consider all of them, but what I was just describing to you was actually within a single mechanism, right? Within a single purchasing contract. So OETC, for example, may have 4 Cisco certified resellers in their contract, or 20.
Solicit from each of those?
And you don't necessarily have to solicit. Hopefully the contract, because it's a price agreement, will have all the pricing laid out for you. So then you're gonna basically take the name of the provider, the price, and that, you know, price being your most heavily weighted factor, chances are the prices are all gonna be the same. So then all of those providers that are listed, you would then score them on those other criteria. And if you didn't know how, you know, if you're not familiar enough with the company, then you would maybe reach out to them and ask them. But you would have to complete that process. You'd have to be able to show that you completed it. So,
OTC has that on their website too.
Mm.
They have a support document that actually has a USAC mini bid sample matrix on there to give
Yeah.
you some
Yeah.
tips and tricks about some of the things that they, you know, might look for or suggest.
Yeah. So they have a really good E-rate page actually that they've created to help people understand how to bid or how to purchase from their contract. So that is something that you have as a resource. So at this point, this is the end of my prepared notes. I really hope that, you know, we've got about 20-ish minutes, 25 minutes. I hope that if you have an issue that is like eating at you, or you're curious about, or a situation that's bothering you, that you'll speak up about it, because everybody in the room could really benefit from the discussion. So does anybody have anything that they have questions about or want to talk about, or frustration they want to vent, or anything like that?
Can you clarify a little bit about how E-rate works with leasing opportunities?
You know,
Can you repeat the question?
oh, that's okay. She was asking about leasing opportunities. I'm not actually terribly well versed in that because I don't have a lot of applicants that ask me about that. That's something I could provide. I could do a little bit more research on. I mean, it used to be, let me think about this. In the past, I've dealt with applicants. They would do weird things with handsets way back in the day, and they would call them leases, and you were leasing to own them, and they didn't like that. But that was because the hardware itself wasn't eligible. Like handsets were not eligible. But the question would be about how to amortize the costs. So, yeah, I've just not encountered that personally, so I would have to look that up.
So you know there's 3 different types of leases. There's the straight lease, or what they call true lease, that just keep leasing it. There's the lease option. At the end of the lease
Where you
period,
get to
have
purchase
an option
it.
to buy,
Mhm.
and usually that's a fair market value.
Mhm.
And then there's the lease to own with the $1 buyout at the end of the lease period. So they will probably decide to treat the 3 somewhat differently, at least draw 2 categorical lines, if not 3.
I tend to agree with you. I'm almost certain that leasing that does not result in ownership would not be eligible at all. Do you agree?
I would
Yeah.
agree. And I think there's
That's-
far less leasable eligibles than there ever were. So it kind of mitigates it because you don't usually lease that stuff.
Yeah,
we
like
were
switches
approached
and
about
things.
leasing wireless access points,
Yeah.
and we said we would prefer not to go that way.
Yeah, low cost. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I have a curiosity question. This is kind of a crystal ball question.
Oh, sure.
With the 5-year pilot in E-rate modernization in 1 more year, and the 5-year budget, and the whole 9 yards,
Yeah.
where do you think that's gonna land? Where do you think it's gonna go at the end of the 5 years?
Gosh, it depends. I mean, if they take back that 1.5 million, then it's going to go, I think it's going to go right back to the old priority system, which would be a nightmare because demand is higher than it ever was, right? Does everybody understand what we're talking about? Okay. So yeah, if we manage to keep the money in the pot, going back to that priority system wouldn't be as scary because there'd be a lot more money and the amount of money that we have right now is almost what we had kind of decided we would need, or what would be fair if we'd been indexing the funding cap for inflation consistently over the life of the program. And when we got our first funding increase back in, it was 2010 or 11, they indexed it for inflation, but only for that year, right? So they had a $2.25 billion budget for 15 years or something, 14 years. And then they said, oh, we'll index it for inflation for 1 year. And so we got like 300 or $200 million or something like that. It was ridiculous. It was not helpful at all. But we're like, okay, great. At least that's something. If you took and went back and calculated it for inflation from the very beginning of the program, it came out to about, I think it was actually right around $4.25 billion. So this $1.5 billion that we got for hardware was, I mean, it seemed at the time that they were really listening to us and like, okay, you're bringing us back to where we needed to be. If we stay here, then the category system may not be so necessary because we'll have some hope of some future funding. But I will admit that I have concerns about whether we're going to be able to keep that money, because the FCC has the authority to vote and take it away. They can say, well, there we go, guys. That was our shot. That was your shot at upgrading your hardware. Enjoy that for the next 10 years till you can afford more. You know, I mean, what do you think?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I wish I had a crystal ball.
Yeah.
I just don't know.
Yeah.
But it is a pilot program, and it is a 5-year program.
Right.
And it does have a focus on broadband and wireless.
Mm-hmm.
What's next?
Right.
Is it going to continue? Is it going to go away?
Right. And I always, up until recently, I really thought it was going to continue because it had the category 2 part, for the most part, has been very successful. The dark fiber stuff is a little, frustrating and scary. But category 2 had been going pretty smooth. I'd had pretty good luck getting people funded, and people were happy. People were happy with what they were getting. And it didn't seem to be all that difficult for USAC to accomplish, right, review-wise. But, yeah, it is a crystal ball question because... But it's something to think about, too, in your planning, Just not counting on that funding being there until we know, we get more answers. Unfortunately, the FCC and USAC have gotten very, very comfortable with waiting until the very last minute, sometimes halfway through the window, to answer questions that we have.
Well, and should districts who haven't used that category 2 allowance be thinking seriously about their one last year to do so?
Yeah.
If it's not going to continue, it'd be nice to know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm encouraging everybody to use it as quickly as you can. As long as you have the need for it. It's painful when you hear somebody, I've had calls of people who said, oh, I didn't know that money was there. We just redid our whole infrastructure. Oh. But anybody else have any thoughts or questions? I accidentally left out the resource slide, but I will include that later. I'll upload it into the little room, and it just has how to contact me, how to join my listserv. How many of you are on my listserv right now? How many of you actually read my emails? Okay, interesting. No, I will put the link up there to join the listserv because I send out newsletters every week that go into detail into some of these things. And then anything new that's statewide or important, like, someone contract got extended, I sent out a note about that. I don't spam you, but it does have a lot of really helpful insight into some of the problems that we're having. And it's free, so you can always put it in its own little envelope off to the side and then read it when you need it. So I guess that's it, guys. If you don't have anything else you need from me, we're good to go. Get you out of here a little early. Go stretch your legs, have a cup of coffee.
Thanks, Sabrina.